You walk and bike on them every day, but do you know the history behind Monona's streets? Monona's main street, Monona Drive, is simply named after the lake it follows. Originally Highway 51, the nickname started as early car owners chose the route for a drive along Lake Monona. The lake, along with 3 other area lakes, was formed near the end of the Wisconsin glacial episode. As the planet warmed and the glaciers melted, it deposited rich farm soil and water, forming the hills and 4 lakes of the region. The plentiful water made the region a home for many animals who would drink or graze along the shore. Streets like Falcon and Pheasant Hill are named after some of the birds that lived near the marshes and lake. People arrived later, following the animals for food. Native Americans were the first humans in the area, arriving perhaps as early as 10,000 BC.
In the Madison area in Dane County, we have evidence that people have been living here for at least 11,000, 12,000 years. The mounds themselves actually were not constructed until about 2,000 years ago, about the time of Christ or so. And about 600 AD, the particular effigy mounds were being constructed.
Many of Monona's streets reflect this heritage. Lake Monona itself comes from native languages. Monona means wild rice to the Potawatomi and reminds us of the wild grasses that grew along the shores and marshes. Others found that to the Chippewa it means beautiful, and it was this definition that the Wisconsin legislature accepted in 1855. Many tribes lived in the area over the centuries, but some streets like Navajo, Neponset, Sioux, Tecumseh, or Pocahontas honor Native Americans from other parts of the country. While those tribes may not have lived in Monona, early developers tried to show the importance of the region to Native Americans with the street names. Other roads are more historically accurate and honor the Ho-Chunk and the mounds of the woodland culture. Panther Trail leads past the Bird Mound to the Panther Mound on McKenna. In the early 1800s, the 4 lakes around Madison had over 1,500 mounds built near their shorelines. While most were destroyed by early settlers, about 10 in Monona were protected, including the 2,000-year-old Outlet Mound, which is thought to be the oldest mound in the Madison area. Most effigy mounds date from about 700 to 1100 AD and were built for a variety of religious and burial reasons. The frequency of their construction shows the importance of the area to Native people.
I think that probably the clan ancestry thing is a little bit too simplistic, and what we might be seeing in these mounds is in fact the actual depiction of the spirit world.
Many Winnebago camped at the 4 lakes in Lake Wingra. Even as the white man cut up the land and built roads in houses, my ancestors came, walking or riding on ponies to their traditional campsites. Bear Clan, Honch, Thunderbird Clan, Wakunja, and Fish Clan, Ho.
There's an Indian mound right on Monona Drive up there by Cottage Grove Road. That mound was special. It's one of thousands that were built out here originally.
Indian mounds prevail right in that area. There's that big one up on Ridgewood, and then even right where that house was built.
And that was all sacred Indian burials originally.
With Bob Birmingham was state archaeologist at the time, changed the laws of protecting all the Indian mounds in the state. They have to have a bigger buffer area around them now than they used to. You can't build up close to them.
The Ho-Chunk were the last Native Americans to live in the 4 Lakes region. Thunderbird is the English translation for the name of the Ho-Chunk Wakunja clan. Henawa is the Ho-Chunk word for the firstborn girl. And Winnequa comes from the Winnebago squaw. Winnebago was a name for the Ho-Chunk taught to European settlers by other Native Americans. And Winnequa refers to the point of land where the area's first settler, Abram Wood, lived with his Ho-Chunk wife.
Abram Woods cut down trees and with his bobsled took it across the ice, and the first house on that hired people that came to build the capital. Mrs. Peck's house was built by Abram Woods, who married the Indian chief's daughter, but he was a real rabble-rouser and liked his alcohol so much he got into fights all the time. And anyway, he was the first white man in the area.
These early settlers started to move in after the Ho-Chunk tribe ceded their lands to the U.S. government on September 15, 1832. The region, along with much of Minnesota and Iowa, were organized into the Wisconsin Territory. The Monona area was surveyed in 1834, and the land was sold the next year. People could buy property for $1.25 per acre, and most of it was purchased by speculators. Judge James Doty purchased 1,200 acres on the isthmus between the region's largest lake and lobbied the new territorial legislature to move the capital to a city he had envisioned for it. Doty called the city Madison, after the recently deceased fourth president, and the legislature agreed. Despite the suburban nature of the area today, the region was quite rural for several decades. Madison had little over 600 residents in 1846 and incorporated as a city in 1856 with 6,800 people.
The town of Middleton, the town of Madison, and the town of Blooming Grove were all one town government, and they split it into three. And that's when in 1850, Reverend Miller, who had 320 acres, because he had to be a farmer as well as a preacher because he couldn't make it on a preacher's salary, he named the town of Blooming Grove, which included all of Monona.
Everybody remembers the town, Blooming Grove Town Hall, which at one time was fairly well centered in the town of Blooming Grove, because the town of Blooming Grove extended over to about where that Tokay farm in Knob Hill, where Knob Hill is, and then it went across the lake about where the Hara River comes in from Lake Mendota to Lake Monona.
There was almost 4 miles between Madison city limits and Monona, and even on horseback, the trip would take an hour. The first Monona settlers were farmers. Early plats of this area show farms with familiar names like Nichols, Frost, Dean, and Springhaven. Many of these farms were owned by gentlemen farmers, investors who owned the land, and hired help to farm it. Nathaniel Dean owned the farm that's now the Monona Golf Course. Dean donated much of his land, including property for the Blooming Grove Cemetery on Flom and the first Blooming Grove Town Hall, which stood at the corner of Dean and Monona Drive.
Well, that's the town hall, and Mr. Dean gave the property for the town hall. And it's on property that at one time he owned, because he owned 408 acres, most of it on the golf course, but it went north all the way to the Novitiate and down to the lake to get the 408 acres. And he was a wealthy businessman by the time he retired in 1880, but he gave the property for the Commonwealth Cemetery, which is known as the Blooming Grove Cemetery, but next to La Follette High School. But his name is on the titles of a lot of the real estate of Monona. He bought and sold real estate after he got out of the retail business on King Street downtown.
Springhaven was the name of the farm owned by the Keyes family. and early judge. The site of George Nichols' farm is easy to find as he donated the property for the first school in the area. R.D. Frost owned land a little further south, and the wooded area is where the name of the Frost Woods neighborhood comes from. The Schluters brought part of Dean, Nichols, and Frost properties to run his farm near the city hall. Wildhaven comes from the Wildhagen farm. The Femright family owned a farm at the corner of 12 and 18 and Highway 51 before Broadway or the Beltline were built.
We were at 925 Dean Avenue. That was, my father was Joe Figgs. He had a farm there, a produce farm, 40 acres. He'd go to the stores on the east side, the grocery stores, and also Ansmeyer's grocery store on Monona Drive, which was the first grocery store in Monona. And we had an orchard. We had a lovely woods, a little small woods, but lovely. Then behind that, at the end of the farm, there was kind of like a meadow where we would keep our 2 cows and a horse. And there was a spring there, so they would have their own water. I lived there until I was married in 1942.
You going down Monona Drive behind where now is McDonald's, and down to the Monona building was the Ellisted property and the Seeliger property. Ellisted's farmed, and their land ran down at that time to about the back of Shore Acres. And there was a barn behind the old Ellisted home on Garden Avenue down here, right on the edge of Garden Avenue. And Seeliger was on the corner where the Monona building now is.
Yeah, I can remember Monona being a big apple orchard. I mean, there was a
Yeah,
lot
there
of apple
were,
trees.
off of Monona Drive,
Yeah.
there was a farm, the Fisher Farm.
Fisher Farm was right across the Seeliger farm.
that-
I had 2 uncles that owned the Seeliger farm that was on the corner of Monona Drive and St. Teresa. And they had a big canning factory behind that. I don't know if you remember that.
No,
but,
I don't.
There was a big canning factory there. And I remember when we were either juniors or seniors, we had a big tomato fight. Remember
Yeah.
that? And I don't know, against one of the other classes, I remember we raided the Seeliger tomato farm to get the tomatoes.
Out at the old airport.
That was Immaculate Heart is
Yeah.
built on part of the Seeliger farm. It went way back there.
But we had a few homes on Monona Drive that were nice. The Ellisteds, they lived in a lovely home on Monona Drive. They had farmland, but they would rent lodging to the school teachers in Nichols. They had a room and board, and the school teachers would live with the Ellisted home. And then there was the Seeligers, who had a farm, and then Fisher, and he had a farm. It was farm mostly. And Schluters, of course, they had 2 farms.
Most of Blooming Grove Township was farmland in the late 19th century, but one area became known for something different. Lake Monona was a popular tourist spot for residents of the growing state capital. The area was a draw for several reasons. In addition to lake activities and Native American history, several springs in the area were advertised for their healing properties. Cold Springs and Clear Springs mark 2 of them, and Toniawatha refers to a large resort built around one place of healing water. The word Toniawatha is not from the Ho-Chunk or any other Native American language. It was probably created to imply ancient mystic powers while still sounding like the English words tonic water. The Toniawatha Resort was built around one clear spring near what is now Stone Bridge Park. The facility opened in 1879 and eventually covered 2 blocks, including guest cabins, a bowling alley, a dining hall, and a band pavilion.
Toniwatha Springs Hotel was built by Dr. William Jacobs, who was the owner of the best hotel in Madison, the Park Hotel, down across from the Capitol. And he's the one that finally answered the challenge to build what amounted to the first resort hotel that was built especially for the resort trade in Madison. And he conceived of operating it as an adjunct to the Park Hotel. In the industrialization that followed the close of the Civil War, the middle class began to enlarge, and the idea of taking vacations started to filter down. Homes and then cottages and hotels were being developed, and these were promoted in large part by development companies that had been formed either by the railroad companies or in conjunction with them. One of the things that the Toniwatha Springs did was, in fact, if you look at the literature that they created, the pamphlets that were sent out to people who inquired as to, what their facilities were, they really played up their healing spring waters. And in fact, they bottled it for sale to people who would want to take some back with them.
The Toniwatha Springs eventually attracted more permanent residents to the area as the capital grew. The early growth in Monona took place along the edges closest to Madison. Madison grew outward, along the shoreline slowly turning the rural landscape into an urban one. Farms would be bought by developers, divided into smaller plots, and turned into businesses and homes for the growing population.
When I was young, Monona was either farmland or along the lake. It was cottages. There weren't many very permanent homes. Very few people would come in the summer, and that was, otherwise it was more cottage. When I was a teenager, my family had a lot, an empty lot over on Lake Monona. That my dad had bought the lot when it was first platted. And it was on the lake shore. It had already, and so we spent our summers out there for about 10 years, not the full time, but weekends.
The house was built, this part of it was built in 1932. The cottage was the first cottage around on Squaw Bay, and it was built in 1911. The bungalow consists of a sort of double house, which we call the house and the cottage. The house was designed by an architect friend of my grandparents named Theron Woolson. My grandmother was interested in continuing the cottage kind of life, even though it was a full-time residence. And so the ceiling, the plaster on the ceiling was darkened, and around the fireplace it was darkened to make it look as though it was very old and everything was all very smoked.
We have these box homes, which are called international style homes.
Right.
And Beatty and Strang were the young architects who designed those. And there are 10 or 11 of them in this 4-block area.
Frost Woods was, at that point in time, during the 20s and 30s, just developing. So it was a new area. So there was a lot of availability of doing something new and different. There weren't established neighborhoods that you had to keep the same styles in. And a lot of people moving out there were generally very progressive thinking people. A lot of them were University of Wisconsin professors. The international style was one of those styles. During the 20s and 30s, it was mostly in the 30s, it was a very new style.
Transportation methods were improving, and the invention of the automobile allowed people to live further away from their work. But people still needed grocery stores and schools nearby, and these urban islands would grow into their own communities.
This area of Monona was sort of like pretty rural and pretty away from the city, even though the city was just close by, or the northern part of Monona was built up and close by.
Right.
The southern part of Monona, within half a mile of the Beltline, was pretty sparsely populated at that time.
So, but there weren't any of the 50s houses then. There were just the lakeshore houses and 1 or 2 up in the woods. And of course, no street lights. And so the lake was my big memory. My grandfather had horses. He owned a fair amount of the property. because he was a civil engineer. He taught civil engineering at the university. With my grandfather, we would ride all around Monona. We would ride over to the hill, which is, I think it's called Knob Hill now, but we called it Round Top. I remember when the Tokies had their farm garden right about, well, just before Southtown. And we used to ride over and say hello to the Tokies. And
Then the road went on down just as far as Baskerville. And if you can picture that, and the only way out was to come down Baskerville, which was a gravel road. I remember there was a fox farm on that road. I think the name was Brivey, I'm not sure. And otherwise, if you wanted to go down where Tonawatha goes now, you just took the path down.
the mailboxes in the 40s were in a clump, and there was a strip of mailboxes on the corner of Owen Road at Winnequa, and there was another strip farther down a little bit, but I'm not quite sure. So the neighbors, when the mail, and then it was only mailmen, would come, the neighbors would sort of collect at the mailboxes and exchange daily gossip and whose kids were sick and whose weren't, and where they were going to camp and who could give somebody a ride to something. So.
And I was just a little kid, but I remember going across Winnequa Road, which was a tar and pea gravel road, in my bare feet, you know, sort of. And in summertime, a lot of kids did that, and your feet got pretty tough. And so we had to spend an hour a day over weeding in the garden, should we say.
And there used to be a sort of a convenience store on what's now Broadway. I remember when they took the building down right next to that log cabin bar place. And that's where we used to ride our bikes and go get bread. And I think we got milk from somebody's farm, and we got vegetables from the truck gardeners that were around. And then my grandmother had a big garden where a lot of those houses are now. Had a big strawberry patch.
And then my uncle's grocery store was there. And then next to that was Hunk's filling station. And that was run by my cousin, my uncle's son. And his name was Thomas, but they called him Hunk, Hansmeyer. And then, of course, the Last Chance, which is, the 19th hole, which is there yet.
But I think during the school year, it was kind of hard on the kids who lived in Frostwoods because everything had to be transported for everything. There was a bus on Dean Avenue, and I remember they used to walk to Dean Avenue and catch the bus to go into town if they wanted to, say, play on a baseball team or go to the movies or meet their friends or something like that.
The population growth in between Madison and the Blooming Grove Town Hall started to put pressures on the town government in the 1930s. Most of the land area in the township was still quite rural, and board representatives didn't feel much need for public services like snow plowing or garbage pickup. But the population growth was significantly higher in the small residential areas along Monona Drive, and commuters wanted modern services.
Of course, it was Public Works that brought about the formation of the city in the first place because they wanted their roads shoveled.
Right.
The people over on the lake wanted their roads cleared off, and the other farmers didn't care whether it got cleared off over there or not. They wanted to be over here.
Was my association with Ernie Furchlin, who helped start the village, and I affectionately still call it the village of Monona, because in his back room at the Ernie's Trading Post, which was a grocery store and so on, he was one of the founders of the village of Monona. They felt the the farmers who controlled the town of Blooming Grove Township, which was formed in 1850, wasn't giving them the snow plowing that they should get and so on. So there were a number of things they were unhappy about. So the so-called gold coasters, as the farmers called them.
One evening, I was on the lake shore doing some work, and this fella come down the next lot, and I didn't know him. He came in over and introduced himself, told me who he was and how I liked the blooming town of Blooming Grove and the general conversation. So it went from there. It seemed as though his main object was to feel me out as far as forming a village. He says, have we got a place to go, to meet? And I said, well, if you want to meet, I've got room in the back of my building, my store building, or these trading posts, and we can meet there, which was agreeable.
Several residents started looking into the possibility of seceding from Blooming Grove and forming a new village. The leaders had names drivers would still recognize: Furchland, Waterman, Rothman, Owen, Starry, and Stone. They met in one of the few public places in the area, the back room of Furchland's grocery store, Ernie's trading post.
The five of us got together. The five of us. There was Professor Owen, Ed Rothman, Walt Simon, Jess Waterman, and myself. We sat around this table and discussed it, the start of it. We had a couple other meetings at the town hall, the old town hall, that weren't so peaceful. A few people from over in Blooming Grove didn't like the idea of seceding. They says, you're the Gold Coast. You got all the property. You got all the income down there. You Gold Coasters aren't satisfied. Now you want part of ours. And that's the way the argument went.
Following a few months of research, the group petitioned residents, and the circuit court scheduled an election on the issue for August 29, 1938. The final vote was 241 to 171 in favor of incorporation. The village of Monona was born.
They wanted to have their own and control our own tax structure and our own city hall. See how nice it is? I don't know if you realize or appreciate it, but in hindsight, I think their efforts were warranted, you know.
I was always impressed with the people who were there, who really loved their city, believed in it, and wanted to develop. They were there at the beginning, and I remember, and one person who I think it was the last village president, Howard Groth, who was, you know, in a way very influential on me in the city government, because maybe he thought we'd continue in city government, and I think he kind of took me aside a little bit and told me about the city, and he told me about the vision that a couple of early people had, that you know, the vision of the swimming pool in a brand new fledgling community. The other was, a lot of the council were not. We see a lot of Monona today as professionals, college educated and that sort of thing, and wanting to have middle class community. But these were people who were ahead of their time and had a vision of a fine, developed community. I think they wanted to have a small community to have everything that Madison had. And I found out later a lot of its history was not being Madison, but wanting to have everything that people could have in a city like that.
Driving through the early village was still a rural affair. Many of the streets were gravel, and much of the center was still farmland. Residents mostly lived along the lake and Monona Drive. Until 1931, Monona Drive was still Highway 51, the main north-south route from Madison. It mostly followed the present route to Femrite Drive, where the highway turned east. Femrite at the time was Highway 1218, and the highway continued west along Frostwoods and Bridge Road. This route would cross the Yahara River on a small black bridge and continue on towards Madison.
I can remember when it was a gravel road going around the north side of Lake Monona, and then when the two-lane highway was in by the time I came in '61.
The Monona Drive stopped at Femrite and went down Femrite to come up around and then the drive this way.
And the highway, the 1218 Broadway Highway, isn't even on this map. And the highway came from the south, from Stoughton and so on, and came up Femrite Drive, and then it went up to Frost Woods, and it went across the Indian Ford on Bridge Road.
When I first came here, Monona Drive was a two-lane highway, no curb or gutters. And then, of course, in the 60s, it was constructed as it was until this latest one. When we first lived, the first house we lived in was on Queens Way, which is one block off Monona Drive. And from at that time, it was called the Pussycat Lounge, which is Salad Creations now. From that building all the way down to Leski's was heavily wooded area. It was just beautiful. And our property backed up to that. And so it was really nice to have that. And then, of course, one day we woke up, heard the bulldozers. All those trees were taken out and the commercial development began.
Winnequa Road did not go all the way to Bridge Road, where you live.
Yeah.
On the lakeside was sort of swampy area, and there were no homes there past about 2 blocks from where Frostwoods and Winnequa intersect. And so I think we had to go up Owen Road or up Frostwoods Road to get out, and then go down Monona Drive, and then to get on what we would call Broadway now.
Broadway was built in 1931 to straighten out this part of 1218 and served as the South Beltline until the late 1980s. During Prohibition and the Depression, the southern portion of Monona was far enough away from Madison so that it was the site of several speakeasies and dance houses. In addition to public areas, the early village board hired a marshal and wrote licensing ordinances to clean up the area.
And the old Black Bridge was a wooden bridge over the Indian Ford, and then it became a steel bridge, and now, of course, it's been upgraded to a very fancy, nice bridge.
If you go on down the lake to the bridge, the old Black Bridge was there, and Hollywood was on one side of it. It wasn't called Hollywood then, but a guy named Roby Gilbert had some activities going on there, and he lived back up just a little ways farther, more just a ways. He had a house of ill repute operations going on. We were always told to keep away from all of that.
Romy had this little place. It was right on the edge of Black Bridge. You remember the Black Bridge? It was at the edge of the Black Bridge. There was a little building, and Romy had the speakeasy in there, and across the road was the Pink Pajamas. And that used to have quite a clientele. That was still operating while I was in the store. But that part was, that was a sore spot down right in the Black Bridge area there.
The marshy flat area on the south side also proved to be an ideal location for the area's first airport. The Royal Airport, remembered today by Royal Avenue, was built on a farm where Southtown is today. The field operated into the 1950s and is best remembered as the site where Charles Lindbergh landed in 1927 when he visited Madison after making his historic flight.
Well, the Royal Airport was when I was a kid when Lindbergh landed there. I think I was 9 years old. And I remember that we had, and the main highway was Frost Woods, that's where I live now. And down and along, you know, across from Monona restaurant there. And we were parked butt to butt naked, and I remember that we were parked and waiting for Lindbergh to land.
Pennsylvania Oil Company Airport, they called it the Penn Field. And Lindy is the only field around here that could land a Ford four-engine deal. And when Lindy came, naturally, when he landed in Madison, that was the only airport worthwhile. But that was a cornfield and converted into, they had the hangars, and it was kind of a nice place.
Most of the streets and homes in Monona today were developed after World War II during the baby boom. The population of Monona grew from about 2,500 people in 1950 to over 8,000 in 1960.
You know, suffered through World War II. Everything was hunky-dory after that. Nothing could go wrong, you know. As long as you had your brothers home and your family home, and lost very few, that it was a blessing. Yeah. And so we concentrated on having family and raising children.
We moved here in 1959 from Illinois. My job brought me up to the east. I had a job in the east side of Madison. And we moved up here then. And
most of Monona was developed in the 50s. It was a big boom. And from early 50s to late 50s. I'm in real estate now too, but you show houses, you can almost guess the ages.
Right.
I've seen it, at least in my area of Monona, from a relatively small rural area in World War II and in the 40s, and then all of a sudden it boomed into a city of lots of houses being built, a lot of young families moving in the 50s and a little bit into the 60s until I think it reached its pinnacle, maybe 13,000 people. So, you know, my area was very sparsely populated, but what we call the Frost Woods area now has 120 homes. When I was growing up, it probably had 10.
probably, I think we were listed as the fastest growing community in Wisconsin at that time. And there was a lot of young people like we were. We had just been married, had one child. And people were moving here, you know, raising their families and that.
And it was very difficult to find a house at that time. Very difficult. You would approach a realtor and say, I want to move to Monona, and they would put you on a list.
And we had big families here.
Yeah, there was a
We
lot of
had
big
a
families.
lot of big families, like 6, 7, 8, 9 kids. I mean, Shukart comes to mind because
Yeah.
Maggie is, you know, so famous in this town for her artwork and stuff. Had 8 boys. I mean, can you imagine it?
No.
And she did all that painting and made all those rugs, and Storms had a bunch of kids, and Dolls had 10 or 11. I mean, we were a village of big families.
Most of the remaining streets are named after developers or their children. Anthony, Gordon, Jeffrey, Joyce, Christie, Maywood, and McKenna are a few examples. The rapid growth was common across the country, and the growing city of Madison started to annex surrounding villages and towns.
And more than one mayor tried to annex, and they couldn't do it. And thank heavens, some people, we were busy raising families and building homes and everything, but some people have an inroad to political happenings, and they didn't want to be annexed to Madison. And I remember, I had 2 children, and I remember I couldn't understand all the fuss about this, but it beat down in hindsight, it was a good movement. And I remember my husband being tapped by Salix and Hesse's. Hesse was an engineer with Gisselt, and so they trotted off to these meetings.
My father, Ed Rothman, founded the city. He was trustee and president for 12 years. And after they did all the infrastructure, such as roads, utilities, etc., the wonderful city of Madison wanted to annex us. And we really had a fight on our hands, but we won. And today we're City of Monona, thanks to our forefathers and their supporters.
Monona residents, wanting to keep their autonomy, began establishing more independent services. The Monona Grove School District is a public child of the baby boom. Schools had been in the area almost as long as Wisconsin has been a state. The first one-building school was built in 1852 near where La Follette High School is today. Like the small roadside markets, schools didn't need to be very large because of the small rural population. A new school was built in 1869 where Nichols stands today. The building was expanded several times over the next years, and students would go to Madison for high school.
I was hired in 1948. The district was at that time called the Nichols. It was built on the property of George Nichols. The main section, that is the front there, faced what was known as U.S. Highway 51 then.
We had to walk to Nichols School. When we left our house, went across Winnequa Road and 1 block up on Owen Road, if you would call it that, on our way to Nichols, or through the fields. It all depended if we were talking the winter or fall or spring, how easy it was to get there. We didn't hit another house until about a block from Monona Drive. So there was just nothing there. If you put, in that direction, there was a big field, which was Owen Road and Moyguera and Bridge Road, and that was the original baseball or athletic field for the area. And Colonel Ray Owen, of Bungle Owen fame, had a sickle bar mower that had a sickle bar in the front of it, and had a snout, and in the spring he'd get up there and we just mow the grass down, and then periodically every couple of weeks or every 2 or 3 weeks.
Graduated from 8th grade at Nichols. We didn't have a high school, so I went to East High, and I graduated from East High in 1941.
I went to a high school at the University of Wisconsin called Wisconsin High. It no longer exists, but there was no high school in Monona that we could go to at the time that I was going, which was in junior high. I left Nichols School in 6th grade, went into Wisconsin High in 7th grade, and that would have been 1950, graduated in 1956. And I think the high school started in 55 or 54. Well, I was a junior or senior. They weren't taking anybody but freshmen and sophomore students to build it up. But at that time, you could go to any school. You go to Edgewood or East, West, Central that you wanted to.
The city of Madison was beginning to look east to find new taxable land for development. But the village had just gone through a decade of development, including the problems of installing the infrastructure and wasn't about to give up control. Madison's need for space for industrial and commercial development led it to become aggressive toward its suburbs. Madison informed the suburban areas that their children would not be allowed to attend Madison high schools after the 1955-56 school year unless they were annexed to the city of Madison. While most of the Blooming Grove territory was annexed to the city, the village of Monona opted to remain independent.
And that's where they planned the next step of seceding. And so the annexation struggle there, Dr. Salek and his side wanted Monona students to go into the city of Madison for high school. And all kinds of people on the other side just said, no, we're going to have our own high school. And that's when they hired Mr. Swan.
And then they had only a 10-month period between the time that the building would get started and when the kids would start coming in here. Well, historically, I think it took about 2 years they felt for a high school building to be constructed. But the architect had consented to get this building up in 10 months.
And he pulled it off. He built a high school in 1 year's time. So they opened in 1955-56. And they served the town of Blooming Grove and Monona and Alice, which was in the town of Blooming Grove then, but when it went into the Madison system. And Glendale went into the Madison system by then Monona Grove, which was Blooming Grove, then took on Cottage Grove, and that's where the Grove came from.
The population growth prompted other public facilities to be built as well. Winnequa Park and the Community Center were built in 1963. The first community festival, called Monona Fun Day, was held in 1964. The Community Center housed the first library until the current one was built in 1968.
Winnequa Park, what is Winnequa Park now, was all marsh, and the city dump was here. So we've seen a lot of changes in
This wasn't here, it was just, and the Monona School used to have a fire down here at graduation times.
Homecoming.
Or was homecoming right down here, right where this parking lot is. And the school was down here, and the kids were down here. It was fun to come over and watch.
And Gene joined the fire department right away because he was on the fire department in McFarland. So, and at that time it was all volunteer. One thing I remember about the fire department is too, back then they got called to fires over the telephone, and so it was kind of a relay system, and there were about 5 of us, the wives. They'd get a call, and then we had to call 5 more, and it kind of went like Pony Express, you know.
Actually, Monona was a very pretty area when we moved here. And of course, what they were doing when we moved here, this was all swamp in here. And they had developed it and were filling it, dredging it, making lagoons and stuff in here. So Monona was known as a community of volunteers.
Volunteers, yeah. They built the shelters. And
we built the park shelters. You know, we built those ourselves, you know. We put the plumbing in them, you know, and different carpenters.
Yeah, Whitey Jenkins.
And did the carpentry work on them. And it was
Ernie
a community
Bollinger.
event thing.
At that time, the city didn't, well, it wasn't a city then, was it?
The village, yeah.
Didn't have money to buy all this stuff.
No.
And people were, you know, moms were at home then. The whole culture is different.
Well, it's people are busier today because of their. But you know, I got into scouting and became a scout leader in Monona. We had Pee Wee leagues and the football stuff and the little leagues and all of that, and it was all done with volunteer. I mean, even the fields were maintained and set up, and a lot of the mowing done and the striping was all done by volunteers.
Yeah.
I remember when the swimming pool was built in the Phoenix in 1963. That was a big thing. That was one of the best things Monona ever did.
Yeah.
And then 30 years later, in 93, they rebuilt, made it a little bit larger and rebuilt the pool.
So there was a lot of stuff going on, and of course for a community this size, having its own swimming pool and stuff, not many communities had their own swimming pool, very few did. I mean, look at how long it took Madison to get an outdoor swimming pool,
But it was people like that that had a vision, and even things didn't look big and slick. They saw that as the future of the community.
The growth even prompted one more change from a village to a city. In 1966, the population had grown to over 8,000 people, and many other cities in the area were much smaller. The village began looking into the process to become a city. The process was delayed by the desire for aldermen to serve at large, and after state law changed the requirement, Monona became a city in 1969. With the new city being landlocked, few new roads were being constructed. The most significant change was the Beltline, which opened in 1988. The Beltline project shows much of the new challenges for Monona. Residents were far more aware of environmental impact. They could see how the lake had changed from their childhoods and wanted to protect the water, whose name means beautiful.
Well, the lake, of course. And that's one of my saddest memories, not memories, but one of my saddest things now is that the lake really doesn't work. But when we were children, we were in and out of the lake all the time.
We go play on the lake all day, in boats, rowboats, canoes, motorboats, and go from house to house or to the islands and just have a great time.
The lake was very important to us, Lake Monona. My father, as you could see, was a fisherman. He fished Lake Monona. My brothers fished Lake Monona. They were sportsmen. They liked to hunt. They liked to fish.
There were a lot of times in the 70s when you didn't want to go swimming unless you could go out in the middle of the lake, which we didn't do with little kids.
The major thrust why my family moved out of Monona was the condition of the lakes. We lived on a lake, and at night you'd have to shut the windows because the decaying weeds were so bad.
And I would drive past the old town hall. I would drive past the Chet Clark house, and they're gone now. One was raised in 67, one was 69, and then people said, maybe we should think about historic preservation. And so then, that way of thinking changed also in Monona, and then that's when the Landmarks Commission was formed in 1975. So those are some changes too. We came to value some of the things that we were losing, and we tried to save what we still had.
Become involved in wildlife protection, especially wetland protection, taking some educational courses from Jim Zimmerman. And he taught us how to advocate. Doesn't do any good to like your wildlife if you don't advocate. Here comes all these plans for building a belt line around Wisconsin, around the lake. Well, they're going to build right across this marsh. That marsh has a lot of value to it. We can't just block that marsh. Can't build a road over that.
The final resolution of that on the environmental issue, if you recall, was the highway was taking 22 acres of wetland, and I don't know who proposed it, but I jumped on it right away. And said, why don't we put in artificially 22 more acres, which we did at the eastern end of the belt line, and the only thing I had to do was get the city council to approve the additional 10% of that cost, which was the city's share of the entire highway there.
When we developed Southtown down there, and we were involved with it as the city, And we had, because it's built right next to the marsh there, that we had to go in to put everything into a huge retention basin. And we got gates on it, that they can be closed off in case there's a spill of any kind in that whole Southtown area there.
Well, we were formed in 1975. And I think, as I said, as a result of losing some of what would be really historic landmarks in Monona. And Mayor Schumacher called and asked if I would be on the commission. And I remember it was very informal at first. And it took us a while to get going, but by 1978, 79, we started to think about, what do we have, what should we mark? Out of that grew the first book, which was published in 1980, and which was very successful. And then we were able to mark, I think, 16 of the 17. And then since that first marking, we have marked others, homes, Indian mounds, and then, of course, we're going to put up the plaque at Ernie's Trading Post for the 75th anniversary.
The shift of the highway also meant a shift in business traffic. When Highway 51 was shifted to Stoughton Road in 1950, Monona Drive still saw growth from the baby boom. The new Beltline meant traffic would completely bypass Monona on the way to Madison. The city has responded with redevelopment, turning old properties once relegated to a rural edge of Madison into a modern suburban city.
I think the biggest change in Monona, of course, is Monona Drive. And I say that because I live there, and I've lived there for 42 years. That has been the biggest change.
When we moved here, Monona Drive was 2 lanes with a canopy of trees overhanging the whole. It was beautiful. And all I can think of is Pebble Beach, which has this traffic backup for miles and miles every day, and they still have just a 2-lane street with trees overhanging.
When I became mayor, you had a junkyard when you drove in on the Beltline. You had a storage facility, which is now Meritor, and you had a trailer park, which is now going to be Trista on the water. And those were all visible developments, things that are at points of entry in your community. So, it was those things out here from the realtors too. Your first impression is those things, and that's not positively received by a lot of people.
Right.
It was hard to get them down here to see the Dream Park and the pool and the library. You sit in this great library just to see the heart of the city because they couldn't get past that front yard. But it was a challenge. It's a lot of work. People don't understand when you have a project that's got that much state and federal funding involved, the hoops, frankly, you have to jump through. So and then you just got down to minutia of, the stone signs on the corner. Well, is that really needed? And I argued, yes, it is, and I'd advocate for that. Or burying utilities. There's people who said we could save a lot of money, just leaving the wires hanging. You're going to do a project like this. It's once in every 50 years. It's transformational. And once they check us out, I think we do pretty well at convincing them this is the place they want to put their family or put their business.
Yet even as the city updates for the future, Monona remembers its past and preserves its history in the stone that marks some of its streets.